I will preface this by saying that I think I'm silly to believe in ghosts, and I get embarrassed to speak about it. The alternative to believing that I was haunted is admitting that I am much more mentally ill than I had ever believed, which is absolutely possible. This took place over a few years in a farmhouse in the desert of Arizona. It was newly developed land. We moved into the place when I was 15. At the time, I was going through a lot emotionally and smoking a lot of weed. That might explain some of my personal experiences, so I'll try not to dwell on them too much. The house was set up almost plantation style. It was very wide, had a big wraparound porch, and lots of awkward corners. The front room was a tall library with an open balcony to the upstairs, which ran into long, skinny bedrooms. My parents' room was closest to the stairs and was attached to a nursery with a sliding ensuite door. My brother's rooms, who were 2 years younger than me, and my room were at the end of a dark hallway. That side of the house never got sun, so it had bad vibes all around. Downstairs, there was a messed-up Harry Potter-style closet, a sunken-in living room, a kitchen in the center of the house, and a sunken playroom for the baby. It honestly started the first day that we moved in. My brother and I were the only ones in the house, and we were unboxing plates. It was so empty that everything in there echoed. I swear it sounded like a little girl laughed, like a creepy track that you could get off of an app or something. Keep in mind, the TVs were not plugged in. We were on an acre of land, far away from the dirt road, and my brother was way too stupid to pull a prank like that. I started hearing voices at night. This wasn't unusual. I honestly used to freak myself out so badly that I think I made noises up to scare myself. My parents had raised me not to talk about things scaring me, to tough it out and be a big girl. It was fine most of the time during the day. Everything bad came at night. I remember distinctly when it started messing with me in bed. In solidarity, my brother and I kept our bedroom doors open for the hallway's nightlight, and in case we needed to call for each other. We had a pretty messed up childhood that might have contributed to all the codependency I'll describe during this. I was falling asleep, but not quite out. I felt the blanket slipping off the bed and reached down to grab it. This was common. I didn't have a bed frame with a foot. It kept slipping no matter how I tried to tuck it. In classic horror movie fashion, the last time I pulled it, I felt tension. There was nothing it could have been caught on. I felt like the second I went from confused to terrified, it bounced back to me. I don't know how to explain this that well, but I was certain that someone was under the bed pulling it away from me. Later I moved another nightlight into the bedroom. It was a kind of spooky amber orange, and I convinced my parents to let me paint the walls cherry red. Again, I was almost asleep, but not quite out, so I don't think it could have been sleep paralysis. I heard the carpet rustle, and maybe joints cracking. It sounded like my mom had come in to check on me. I opened my eyes, and immediately froze. I don't think I've ever been more scared in my life. There was a woman crawling across my floor from the far side of my room to the foot of my bed. She was pale and stringy-haired as if she were going bald. I couldn't see her face. I don't know how I fell asleep. I couldn't scream or move. I think she disappeared under my bed. But again, this could always be a hallucination. My baby brother was about 7 months old when she started coming out during the day. My mom was a teacher at the time and was able to stay home with us during summer vacation. It was lunchtime and we were watching a movie quietly downstairs while the baby napped. There were noises upstairs, as if something had been dropped to the ground. We listened for a second before my mom ran up. She thought the baby had fallen out of his crib. We opened the door and found him sound asleep. There was weird white stuff on the floor. It took us a while to figure out that it was drywall or something like that. There was a crawl space to a small attic where the AC and insulation could be reached. It was barely big enough to get into and a good 9 feet from the ground. It also had to be pushed up and slid over to open. There was a visible gap. The carpet was a really ugly dark blue, so we could see the white spots on the ground as if something had been dragged from one side of the room to where the crib was, and it stopped right in front of it. My mom checked the closet and called my stepdad. He couldn't leave work, so he stayed downstairs until he got home and checked the crawl space. We have never had animals. It's really difficult for most things to live in Arizona, so wildlife is pretty rare in that area. He didn't find anything, or signs of anything living up there. This happened every other day for 2 weeks. We really didn't know what to make of it. My mom thought it might be the AC suctioning the opening upward. It stopped and didn't happen again for 2.5 years, until my baby sister was born and stayed in the same crib. Again, it happened on and off for a few weeks, and never again. To keep my own solo experiences brief, I had a period of 3 months where I straight up did not sleep. I went crazy. Every night, I felt like my bed was shaking. The instant I laid my head down, it would vibrate, the metal frame would sway, and I would feel as if something was pushing the mattress between the baseboards or sitting on the corner. I had my brother touch the frame one night to tell me if the shaking was in my head or not. He said it wasn't, but I'm still not sure if he wasn't just playing into it. I thought I might be having seizures or something. At one point I got so frustrated I started sleeping on the couch downstairs with the dog. I started hearing whispers too. Not a noise that sounded odd, but someone calling my name. My name has 3 freaking syllables. I would be in my room, door open, doing something at night after my parents went to bed. It was a female voice, but it sounded off. I don't know how to explain it. The downstairs really scared me after the lights went out, so I never went down, but I did walk to the balcony and look. I never saw anything, but the whispering would stop when I got close. My brother started hearing it too. He's kind of weird. His life's dream has been enlisting in the army, so his reaction was always getting his knife and walking right downstairs to confront it. He would turn the lights on and look around before coming right back up. He slept on my floor a few nights because he was convinced that she wanted me. We had prior haunting experiences, which led to my parents making jokes that the ghosts follow us. They didn't pay much attention to it at the time when it was quiet. One night my parents went out with the babies. My brother and I were in our rooms, doors open per usual. We started hearing something strange. At first, I thought it was the wind. It got louder until it was clear that a woman was wailing. I know it sounds crazy, but it was so clear. We hid in my room for what felt like hours, calling my mom. For some reason, it never occurred to us to call the police. Eventually, the crying stopped. We hatched a plan to run for the stairs and out the nearest door. All of the lights were on in the house, and my brother has his stupid knives. It's like it knew that we were going to leave. We heard shuffling outside the door, and maybe breathing? I guess it could have been the air conditioning. We kind of decided that we were ready to die, unlocked the door, and booked it. The crying started again, and it was very clear that it was coming from my parents' room. We stood outside the property line for another hour waiting for them to arrive, watching the house. No one could have gotten out without us seeing. We had huge windows lining the upstairs hallway that showed everything with the lights on. My parents again made fun of us, and still do about that night. A few other incidents include my baby brother talking to the man upstairs. He would stand in front of the balcony and chat up to someone. He told us that the man was hiding in my room. He talked about the man in the window and would ask, "Who's that?" directed to the doors at night. I don't want to talk about all of it, but there were so many instances of voices, doors slamming, and things being knocked over in my room that I really did think I was losing my mind. I moved out at 18 and came back occasionally, usually to babysit. Apparently, my reluctant believer mother and absolute skeptic stepdad watched a coffee pot jump off of the counter. They were also outside sitting and having an open fire while drinking coffee when they saw a figure in the balcony window of our room. It was a tall man, but my stepdad still needed urging to go upstairs. It appeared a second time, closer to where the nursery door was. My mom said she had horrible dreams about a man in the corner of her room after that. She was present for many of the instances where we heard footsteps upstairs, doors slamming when the AC was off, etc., but she always denied that there was anything wrong. Once my parents left town with the kids for a week. At this point I was 19 and living happily an hour away. My mom begged me to check on my brother and stay a few nights for the weekend. I arrived during the evening after I got off of work. I asked how had things been when he was alone. He said he was fine, he just didn't go upstairs at night and, quote-unquote, minded his business. He said if he ignored it and tried not to get scared, then it in return ignored him. He felt safe with the dog. We were watching YouTube and eating when we started to hear a deep noise. At first I thought it was a bike or one of the small buggies that people drove out here. Then I noticed that it was holding a tune. It was humming. The dog had a weird thing about staring into the bathroom if the door was open, which is scary at night. This time, the door was closed, and he still stood up and stared. The noise was so deep that it sounded as if it couldn't have been human, but it was definitely melodic. There's nothing I could think to figure out to try and explain it. My brother and I just kind of looked at each other. Then, a door slammed upstairs, and we decided to nope out of there and go for a walk. When we got back, I decided that I would sleep in my parents' room. It didn't feel right to stay in the kids' room, but looking back, it would have been best to stay close to my brother. I fell asleep surprisingly easy. I guess about 2 hours passed before my brother slammed the door open. The house smelled like it was burning. Not really like a fire smell, but more like burning plastic and trash. I was panicked. I was the adult and had no idea what to do in that situation. We checked the house. I turned off the air conditioning, thinking it might be on fire. We opened all the windows and fell asleep on the couches downstairs. The next day the smell was still lingering, but less overwhelming. The air conditioner was fine when I turned it back on. Like usual, the day was fine. That next night, my brother and I went on a Jack-in-the-Box run. It might have taken 30 minutes. We arrived home to a mess of blood, vomit, and shit. The dog was sick all over the living room. We immediately took him to an emergency vet, certain that he was dying. They checked him for everything that they could and gave him a clean bill. When we got home, all hell broke loose. My brother and I were cleaning up the mess with the doors open for airflow. There were absolutely insane banging noises coming from upstairs. We hadn't locked up on the way out. My brother thought that someone had snuck in and was trashing the place. He went up to check, and I hung out downstairs ready to call the cops if need be. Nothing happened. Nothing even seemed out of place. We kept cleaning, but the noise started almost immediately. It kind of sounded like someone was shouting behind a wall of cement. I couldn't tell the gender. My brother told me he had been fine until I got there, that I could leave if I wanted. I totally did, and I didn't go back. My parents sold the house this year. During the interim of the move, they stayed in an Airbnb. My brother lived really close to his work, so he stayed in the house with the dog for a few weeks. This story is just his own, so I'm not sure if I believe it. Like I said, he's kind of strange, but he's also not really one to embellish. He had been hearing the usual things, even his name being called in the night, but ignored all of it. His friends had been coming over to keep him company. The last day he was supposed to finish moving, he brought another friend. He says he felt that they were being watched the whole time when they cleared the place out, and his friend left him to lock up. They got into the car facing the house when they noticed that the blinds were open. They were definitely closed on the way out. His friend claims that he saw them open from the corner of his eye. My brother says that there is a woman squatting in front of a downstairs window, close to where he had just left from. She was pale, her nose was hooked, and her hair was black and stringy. Again, classic horror movie ghost. He said she had black eyes with visible white dots in the centers. Inside-out eyes, as he called them. And she was smiling. He says it took him a second of shock to realize that she was looking directly at him. He felt sick, like she could walk right out and get him. They burned rubber when his friend snapped out of it, and they screamed at each other all the way down the road about what they saw. He called me right after to explain it, but I was with my own friends and not really willing to listen at the time. What messes me up is that my mom thought he had a psychotic break. He went into his room and cried all night at the Airbnb. She thought something had happened with his girlfriend. My brother is not a crier. I haven't seen him do that since we were little. When we got together and talked about it, his eyes teared up then, too. He said he didn't know why, but he knew that she wanted to kill him. He drew a picture of her. It's not great, but it still fills me with the deepest foreboding. It took me a while to realize that I saw her too, just once in my bedroom almost 5 years ago. Suddenly it made sense. I knew it didn't feel like a woman, but it felt feminine, like something pretending to be a woman. My ex brought this up today. We dated all through high school and had a few experiences together that she recounts as her only paranormal encounters. I would love to still think that this was my own delusion, but it was shared by way too many people. Maybe a few things can be explained, but most of it truly can't. It has affected me so deeply that I'm still terrified that if I think too much about her, she'll follow us a state away. This is a series of events that occurred when I lived on a plot of farmland a couple of years ago. I was pregnant with my daughter, and my boyfriend worked late at night, so I was home alone a lot. Things were okay for a while, but as time went on, it started feeling strange in the house. I always felt like I was being watched while in my bathroom and the hallway right by it. I started feeling uncomfortable around windows at night. I figured I was just scared of being there alone. One of the first strange events happened while my boyfriend and I were in bed. While watching TV, I saw the door handle to our room slowly turn as if someone were about to open the door, but then it turned back. It caught me off guard, and I was trying to get my boyfriend's attention, but it stopped when he finally looked. Things began falling off the surfaces outside where my boyfriend would go to smoke cigarettes. He told me he would feel breathing on his face while in bed. He told me several months after it started happening, thinking that it would freak me out if he told me. He's not the type to jump to a "it's a ghost" conclusion. After I had my daughter, I was even more scared to be in the house by myself. I even began locking myself in our room every single night. One night, I was waiting for him to come home from work. It was around 3 a.m. I heard the door handle jiggle as if someone were about to come in, but then stopped. I figured my boyfriend had to use the bathroom or something. After waiting for about 10 minutes, I called him asking why he didn't come in yet, and he told me that he wasn't even home. My friend came over to hang out with me and my daughter, I was changing her while my friend was in the other room. I heard someone say, "Hello?" And I thought it was my friend, but she said she heard it too, and that it wasn't her. I would get my friend to come pick me and my daughter up frequently when my boyfriend was at work because I was so afraid. One night, I had an overwhelming feeling of danger and had them come get us. I was taking my daughter's car seat out to their car, and it literally felt like someone yanked it down and out of my hands. I didn't drop it. I don't know how to explain it other than to say just that it was yanked or jerked down. I hated being in this house. I can't even explain the feelings that I felt all the time. I was just so terrified, and I'm so happy to be out of there. We moved away 3 years ago. On moving day, my boyfriend told me there were garbage bags at the top of the stairs that were placed in a way that they weren't going to go anywhere. But as he and his brother were loading up the last bit of stuff out the front door, he saw these bags come tumbling from down the stairs. My bland storytelling does my emotions no justice. I've never been so scared just to be in my own house every night. As soon as the sun would set, the whole vibe would shift. I thought I was crazy. I was getting angry and upset far too often over nothing. I honestly dread the idea of ever going through something like that again. Honestly, I don't think I've ever experienced paranormal activity in terms of seeing something. But ever since I was a kid in my childhood home, I was really scared, almost traumatized of seeing something or hearing something in the dark at night. No specific reason for it. I would just stare at the door frame of my room, which was always opened at night, and wait for something to show. I never even liked horror movies, and even now at 21 I avoid them because I know they freak me out, so I don't believe that the fear came from the movies. The thing is, I moved to a different city when I was 18 years old and changed a few apartments until now, and in every single one of them, I felt chills. Everything is fine, and then comes a certain time of night when it's like the energy in the room changes, and I have a feeling that someone is watching me. I always believed that if I could convince myself not to believe in spirits or that the paranormal is real, then I can escape from that, and nothing weird will happen to me if I don't believe or give it attention. Am I right? But here we are. I started to think, what if the cold, watching feeling and fear I get every night is related to some childhood trauma that I might not remember? Fast forward to today. My boyfriend and I moved back to his parents' house after the lockdown. We have a separate upper apartment for ourselves, and no one but him ever lived there. We have spent so many months and nights here before, and really the apartment never gave me any chills. Until the last month or so. So lately I have this really bad vibe in this place, especially at night. It can be dark outside around 6 p.m. or 10 p.m. and everything is super. Then there just comes this time, after midnight, when the air in the room changes and I feel like something negative has entered. The whole energy is negative, and the feeling of someone looking at me returns. Most of the time I'm scared to have my eyes open, that I might see something. He doesn't feel the same thing and says it's because of the stress and anxiety. And true, it might just be paranoia, and I'm going crazy. But I had several nights when I really did feel like something was messing with me. I would wake up with a sensation like someone had pushed me, and my boyfriend was dead asleep. I would have sleep paralysis and again would have a feeling like someone is poking me and hear banging noises that weren't there. I was sleepless for a few nights, and then I started taking Xanax just to make me fall into deep sleep to get some rest. When I am able to sleep, there's that time before falling into sleep when I feel the most vulnerable because of the dark and the dead silence. There are radiator noises and downstairs noises, which, by the way, are loud footsteps even in the middle of the night. And sometimes I would ask them if they were awake at the time, and they said they were sleeping. But still, I kind of comfort myself with the idea of it just being normal house noises. The worst thing is going to the bathroom at night. I have bladder issues, so it's normal for me to go at 1, 2 a.m. Don't know why, but I noticed this pattern. And often, I'm just terrified. I use my phone as a flashlight and practically run there. If I can hold it, I do, because that's how scared I am of the negative energy in the air. I'm so afraid of seeing a shadow or a face staring at me. It's like I know that something is present, but I'm unable to give it shape or form. Sometimes it's like I can sense someone's breath on my face. Never thought I would write something like this, because it is the opposite of ignoring the problem and convincing myself that I am imagining. But I'm not sure what to do anymore. Every night I lay in my bed, and in just moments, the air in the room switches to negative, cold, and spooky. I can't live like this. It's stressing me out so much, and I just want to know if it makes any sense. Am I crazy and too paranoid so that I just imagine all of this? Or could it really be that something is there? About 10 years ago, I moved into a new home in Indiana with 3 roommates. I won't go into too much detail about where the home is located out of respect for my former roommates, one of which still lives there. I will say that it is located in a very old part of town, a few blocks off of one of the very first main roads that used to be in the town, that was settled in 1846, I believe. Anyway, this house was definitely not what comes to mind when you picture a haunted house. It was built sometime in the early 80s or early 90s. It was pretty ordinary looking. 3 bedrooms with a small loft area, tiny bathrooms, and not a whole lot of room for 4 adults to spread out. But when you're a college student in your early 20s and have the opportunity to split rent 4 ways, this seemed perfect. We had all our own tiny little spaces, shared a kitchen and living room, and spent most of our time just bullshitting around the dining room table. The house was owned by an older couple who lived in a city about 20 minutes away. They began renting the home out to help finance their retirement. They were sweet, and pretty relaxed on any rules for the home. They told us right off the bat that they were not physically fit enough to do any maintenance or repairs on the house should anything go wrong, so we were told to call them with any issues, and they would send over their handyman, or whichever professional was needed. They never came to the house. Not once. We paid rent by money order through the mail. I didn't find this strange at the time. The first weird event occurred about a week after we all moved in. We all worked the night shift at our respective jobs, so the house was empty all night and we arrived home around the same time early in the morning. We dragged ass into the living room to enjoy some sort of fast food breakfast before passing out when we realized that the entire carpet downstairs was soaked. A pipe had burst beneath our dishwasher during the night and flooded the kitchen, dining room, and living room. Our landlords had the floor replaced within a week, and we went on with our lives. Then, about a week later, we were baking cookies in the oven when all of a sudden the cookies burst into flames. The oven was producing so much heat that I was afraid that the whole thing would catch on fire. The landlord sent a repairman who told us that something had caused the internal thermometer in the oven to be so uncalibrated that you could set the oven temp to 300 degrees, but it would be more like 475 in there. Again, we had it fixed and moved on. It wasn't long after that when the unexplainable and unnerving activity began. The ceiling fans in the rooms would turn on randomly, and they would spin so hard that they would rattle and shake to the point that it looked like the thing was about to fly off of the ceiling. Every room was equipped with button switches. There are 4 buttons on the wall, 1 for the light and the other 3 for various speeds for the fan. the fan would make a two-tone chiming noise when you would push the button to turn it on. No one would be able to turn on a fan without pretty much everyone in the house hearing this chime. We were creeped out, but chalked it up to faulty wiring or a power surge. That chime still haunts my dreams. Then came the TV issue. We all pulled together to buy a large flat-screen TV for our living room. Brand new, name brand, extra warranty. The TV would turn on by itself constantly. We returned it to the store, exchanging it for a new one, and thought it would be fine. We would be outside or in a different room and hear the chime, go turn the fan off, and realize that the TV had just turned itself on. This happened 5 or 6 times a day. It was unable to be ignored. 2 separate things in 2 different rooms turning on almost simultaneously. The electrician was called. He found no signs of faulty wiring, and I think he thought we were making it up. After months of this, we began to hear the whistling. 3 notes whistled by an unseen force at all times during the day. This would usually happen when you were in a room by yourself. I would get this sick, anxious feeling like I was being watched, and right then, I would hear the whistle. Someone or something wanted our attention, and he got it. 3 of us were totally convinced that our house was haunted. Our other roommate was a skeptic, and also pretty much had to make this living situation work, or he would be sleeping in his car. About a year and a half of living in this house, dealing with constant phenomena, it ramped up again. We would be in the kitchen making dinner, go eat in the living room, and come back to find every cabinet door open. Sometimes the refrigerator and oven doors were open too. This happened probably 3 or 4 times a week, on top of all the other crap. I was over it, but had no idea how to fix it. I went to Borders bookstore and got a few books about ghosts and hauntings and different information about getting rid of the creepies in one's home. I decided to do a smudging, and I could not have been more sorry about that decision. We planned to do all the sage smudging together, and our Catholic roommate also had his priest come in and do a house blessing that same day. Holy oil and water were sprinkled in each room, the smell of white sage burning. We thought it was over. The next morning, I was walking downstairs like I had a million times before, when my feet completely flew out from under me and I was airborne. I remember thinking, this isn't possible, right before I smashed into the stairs. I landed on my back, right at the edge of them. Picture Lucy pulling the football away before Charlie Brown can kick it, and his tiny feet are kicking in the air. I was Charlie Brown. I landed not on my butt or side, but squarely on my thoracic spine, the upper area of my spine. How on earth did I defy gravity? I had now tripped. I was barefoot on carpeted stairs, sober, and holding the railing. I didn't feel a push. I felt a sweeping force take my legs out from under me. I broke 4 vertebrae in my back, about parallel with my shoulder blades. I've had injections and nerve damage and back braces and a chronic pain that isn't normal for someone in their 20s. I began to look for a new place to live. I found out that I was pregnant with my son about 2 months later, and decided that the risk was too great to live in that house pregnant, so I packed up that night, told my roommates that I would continue to pay my portion of the rent until our lease was up, and moved back in with my parents. I was only staying with my parents for about a month before finding a new safe place for my baby, my now husband, and I. But I lived constantly on edge thinking, what if it followed me? It didn't. What did follow me are the nightmares where I relive the feeling of terror and dread washing over me, and every so often, I can still hear the whistle. Before we begin, you must understand that everything you are about to read is absolutely true, and the events continue to this day. It was last summer. My girlfriend, now wife, and I finally made the big decision to move in together. Cobblestone Square is a situation of apartment complexes surrounding a central park. After living in another apartment for 2 years, I learned that a bigger apartment was opening up on the other side of the complex. We needed more space because my wife had 2 children from a previous marriage. After a rushed inspection, we were happy to move in right at the start of June. The months passed by, and the days grew shorter and colder. Autumn was drawing to a close, and with it, that's when the trouble began. In all the stories and movies, it starts out small. Things moving from place to place, lights being left on, etc., all chalked up to forgetfulness. This was true in our case, and we didn't think much of it. It only started to escalate with the children. Our apartment is set up with 2 bedrooms and bathrooms on opposite ends from each other. In our bedroom, we have our own private bathroom, and next to the kids' room is a small hallway leading to their own bathroom. We would give them baths in there and potty train, and almost as if flicking a switch, when the autumn months came, our youngest, a 2-year-old girl, would absolutely hate going in that bathroom. At the mere mention of bath time, she would go into hysterics, or on good days, she would sit in the tub, and in the process of bathing, she would look past myself or my wife and start screaming and crying. Oftentimes something would catch her eye in the mirror, and she would also start crying like mad. The most unsettling part would be that as soon as we took her out of the bathroom, she would stop and act as if nothing had happened. Our son, who was 4 at the time, would also run up to us and say that he would hear a voice saying, "Uppy," which was a common saying among the children when they wanted to be held. We asked if it was his sister, and he would profusely say that it wasn't, but he said it sounded like a kid. This happened a few times. With my wife being separated from her first husband and splitting custody, we would have the children come live with us every other week. On the weeks that the kids would go stay with their dad, the activity would seem to die down, but that didn't mean that it wouldn't happen at all. I asked my wife what she remembered from last year, and she recounted a time when we didn't have the children and she was cleaning the house. She noticed the kids' door was open. We usually keep it closed, but she thought maybe I had went into their room for something. She checked to see if I was inside, and seeing that I wasn't, she closed the door and didn't really think anything of it. It wasn't until a while later that she went to use the kids' bathroom and saw that the door was open again. She found me in our room and asked if I had opened it, and I said that I hadn't. With more incidents of lights being found on and doors opening, it all came to a head near the end of October when I was washing dishes in the kitchen. Above the sink, facing the living room, is a small window that allows someone in the kitchen to look out into the dining room and the living room, and additionally the back door, which is a sliding glass door. Important detail. After the kids had been put to bed and were asleep, my wife and I went about our normal duties and chores, trying to finish up before the next day started. As I was washing dishes, I looked up from the sink and saw in the glass of the sliding glass door the reflection of a large shadow in the hallway to the kids' bedroom. It quickly entered the bathroom, and I immediately walked over, turning on the light, and seeing nothing there. I went to my bedroom where my wife was vacuuming, and I asked her if she by chance went into the kids' bathroom for whatever reason. I wasn't surprised by her response when she said no, and I told her what I had seen. It was after this event, and subsequently Halloween, that all the activity seemed to stop. More months passed by again, and we jumped to 2020. August. As soon as the activity started again, I began to keep a journal of all the findings. That way there was a record. On August 10th, I went to the bathroom, the kids' bathroom, before going to bed, and heard a small child giggle. Both children were fast asleep. On August 11th, my wife was bathing our daughter, and for the first time in a year, our little girl started to shriek in fear until she was out of the bathroom. On August 13th, while getting ready for bed, our son knocked on our door. I'm always the one to answer, and he told me that he was afraid. He wouldn't elaborate on why, but when I laid him down in his bed, he begged for the closet to be closed. The closet has never been a problem, and a few nights after this we returned to it being opened and haven't experienced anything like it again. On August 15th, my wife and I had an argument, and I went out to the couch to sleep for the night. As I was tossing and turning, I heard a child's voice in the night say, "Uh-huh," as if answering a question. I didn't react, and forced myself to go back to sleep. Both myself and my wife have caught our son speaking to himself as well. My wife told me that once she heard him saying, "Ow, stop it, you're hurting me." And when she went to go check on him, he was in the hallway by the kids' bathroom, holding his arm. During the daytime, the kids were playing, and both me and my wife were doing our own thing. As I was sitting on the couch, our son runs behind the couch and stops, and then says, "And how would you do that?" out of the blue. I turn to him and ask him who he's talking to, and after a moment's hesitation, he says, "Nobody." I told him I heard him say something, and he then insisted that he didn't say anything. On one occasion, my wife was sleeping on the couch, and in the middle of the night heard a man's whisper say, "Don't get up," to which she promptly obeyed. It was the night after that I woke up from my sleep in bed to see a shadow shape standing over me with piercing red eyes. I felt as if it was going to hurt me. My wife and I have naturally begun our interest in the spiritual world. We began researching and looking for ways to go about this. We've purchased a Ouija board with no results, and from a medium, a supposedly haunted ring. If our apartment was going to be haunted, we wanted to know by who and with what intention. It seems as if our mail-order ghost has already made their home, as one morning our front door was unlocked and slightly ajar, with nothing stolen. Tonight, as I write this, my wife and I were watching TV on the couch and decided to call it an evening. But as we got to our bedroom, I noticed a low scratching sound coming from the record player. I opened it up and saw that the turntable was moving as the needle was off its holder, turning the record player on. I replaced the needle and tried knocking the player a few times to see if it could have been easily bumped or knocked off, but no. The only way to move that needle was to pick it up with your fingers and set it down. I was reminded of one other time that this happened, long before we bought any haunted items. I am thoroughly convinced that my apartment is haunted. People die in them way too often to think it's not a possibility, and if nobody died here, the cemetery across the road definitely doesn't bring me any comfort. I can say that two distinct entities can be somewhat accounted for, a small child ghost and something else. Or maybe something that wants to be viewed as a child, but let's think happy thoughts. We still live here to this day. Autumn is just beginning, and that's when things really seem to get interesting. I'm not saying we have a ghost, spook, or spirit. But something phenomenological is definitely happening in our home. The brief background on the home is that it's over 70 years old in an older part of our town. The previous resident was a well-respected attorney in the area, and he died here. We wouldn't learn this until after we moved in. The house was almost completely dismantled and rebuilt with new everything. Paint, electric, plumbing, drywall, etc. One floor. Not a whole lot of square footage. An attic that has about 2.5 feet of clearance. Not long after getting moved in, my wife and I learned a little bit more about the house's history, and that the previous owner had passed away, and that it was quite some time after his death before he was discovered. We made peace with this information, and continued settling in. The first peculiar incident wasn't really that peculiar. It had been well over a year since the previous owner passed, but he kept receiving mail. A lot of mail. Fun mail, too. Magazines and newspapers with the subscriptions renewing. We remarked on the mail as being merely interesting, and for the sake of creating a tradition, we always kept the old attorney's mail for a day or two, in case he just wanted to read it. Eventually, this would trickle to a stop. The second peculiar incident caught our attention. After 2 months of being in the house, we decided to get newer, better locks for the doors. I had a new key, my wife had a new key. 2 extra keys went on the key hook. A few days go by, and my wife asked me if I had lost my key or if I had trouble locking or unlocking the door. I hadn't. She showed me the 2 extra keys. Both were still on the wire ring, and both had bends of about 15 degrees right at the key's shoulder. We agreed that this was odd, but we let it go with some loose rationalizations. The third peculiar incident started a little over 2 years ago, and continues still. Neither I nor my wife smoke. However, about once every 2 weeks on a random day, and usually after midnight, the distinct odor of warm cigarette smoke can be smelled in our living room. At first, we thought it was someone walking nearby, or a neighbor, or an odd or unfortunate combination of smells from a garbage can. We got some cameras, and pointed them outside to see what we could see. Nothing. The last time we smelled cigarettes was about 2 weeks ago. And we've had electricians check our wiring on unrelated matters just in case. The fourth incident relates to the second. 2 metal spoons in the silverware drawer were bent. Almost snapped. Aside from the cigarette smoke, it's been a while since anything has happened, until last week. For whatever reason, the attorney's mail is resumed and the 5th peculiar incident has occurred. I work out in the woods, and my wife now works from home in the company of our 2 cats. In a flurry of texts and phone calls, she told me that it sounded like someone was running around upstairs, as if they were rushing across the house to answer the phone, was how she described it. We've had squirrels in our useless attic and the occasional tree branch. The footsteps exceeded both of those. The 6th and most recent peculiar incident is equal parts mundane and intriguing. We have a favorite spatula. Yes, we do. Some of you reading this probably have your own favorite spatula, spoon, fork, pot, pan as well. We used the bright robin's egg blue utensil to make our Thanksgiving dinner and set it aside with the rest of the cooking detritus. That evening, and the following morning, the kitchen is cleaned and everything is put away. Sunday began the greater holiday baking season, requiring the favorite spatula. Except, it was missing. The ceramic container where the utensils are stored has everything else. Red things, green things, metal things, wooden things. Visual inspection of the surrounding area results in zilch. Every cupboard and drawer opened and investigated to nothing. We sadly conclude that after the big cleanup, it must have ended up in the trash. So we began an online hunt for its replacement. On Friday last, I get a picture of the utensils sitting quite happily amongst all the others. I was confused by this, since the evening before we had to use other tools instead of the missing spatula because it was missing. So, sometime after 9:30 p.m. Thursday and 7:18 a.m. on Friday, something that was missing for at least 5 days returned. So, here it is in order. 1. A confluence of strange coincidences. 2. Sleepwalking. 3. Someone is managing to live in our attic. 4. That I and my wife are in a weirdly mutual prank cycle. Or 5. Something real is happening. If you have any ideas, tests, solutions, resources, or suggestions, I'm listening. Nothing seems malvoyant about what's been happening, but it's definitely happening. I come from the county where Ireland's most haunted house, Loftus Hall, is located. If you want to know the history of Loftus Hall and the original story to it, I'm sure you can find it on Google. People that have visited all have their own stories of experiences at the house, and I'm going to share with you some of my experiences that I've had over the years. I lived about a 30 minutes drive away from it, so it was a destination that we visited a lot. I remember the first time I visited the grounds of the house. I was maybe 5 or 6 years old and was visiting it with my uncle. As we drove up the long lane leading the way to the house, I remember looking at all of the windows and getting a shiver as we approached. We parked and got out of the car. I stood and stared at the house. We walked around the grounds and around to the side of it where, at the time, there were apple trees. We picked some of them, as they were red and juicy, and put them in a bag to bring them home with us. When we got home and got the apples out of the bag, every single one had a rotten part on one side. I mean, a big, green, soft, gooey lump on all of them. Another time, when I was around 14, I had went to Loftus Hall with my friend and his mom. There's a nearby lighthouse that's open for people to visit, and we went there first. When we got to the house, there were a few people around, and a young American family there. A mom, dad, and 2 girls, aged around 5 and 9-ish. The 2 girls were running around and playing on the grounds when they ran to their parents laughing, and the 9-year-old said, Mommy, Ann wants to show us something. Can we go to her room?" Now this may seem like normal child behavior, but Ann is the name of the girl in the original haunting story of Loftus Hall. I must also mention that the actual house was not open for guests to go in and out of as they pleased. Not at that time. When I was 16, that was my first time going into the house. We booked a tour on Halloween night. There were some ghost hunters who do an overnight stay every year, and a certain amount of guests can stay there with them for the night. We arrived and went in. We set up our sleeping bags while the ghost hunter crew set up their equipment. We took the tour of the house at night with a tour guide and in groups of 5. We went to each room with the guide giving the story behind it. We got to a room called the Tapestry Room. This is the most famous, and apparently most haunted room in the building. It's said that Anne was locked in this room, and she died in the room as she stared out the window waiting for her mysterious stranger to return. You can actually find the details of this story online. She was locked in there, and sat with her knees to her chin, and when she died, her body could not be straightened. Anyway, we entered this room, and it was freezing. One of the guests in our group, now I don't know if they were paid actors or not, but one of the guests in our group collapsed and went into a fit, arms and legs flailing everywhere. An ambulance was called, and he was sent to the hospital. Apparently, it happens often that people collapse and have seizures once they enter that room. The house is situated on a cliff, and the sea is in the background. About 4 years ago, we went for a drive down there on a foggy evening, and we were looking out to the sea. As we did, we saw the outline of a ship. It looked like something out of the Pirates of the Caribbean, but it floated through the fog and vanished. There have been hundreds of encounters regarding this house that are recorded. Everyone has their own experiences from visiting, everything from feeling queasy in certain parts of the house, to seeing ghosts in the windows, to meeting people while on tours that nobody else who was on the same tour remembers. There's also a hole in the ceiling that goes through the roof, and this is where the devil flew through to escape from the house. Over the centuries, this hole has been repaired multiple times, but each time it is repaired, it will only last for a few days, and then reopens again in the same place. For some context, I live in an apartment with 3 other people while we go to college, but it's currently just me until January since the others went back home. I was singing a song that got stuck in my head when I heard whistling from the kitchen at the same time to the same tune. I thought one of the other roommates may have come back early, so I shouted out to them, but didn't get a response. I went to the kitchen, which is only just a few feet from the bathroom, and no one was there or anywhere else in the apartment. I checked the hallway outside, but didn't see anyone or hear a door open and shut in the few seconds that it took for me to get to the door. The whistling was very airy, as if it was someone who couldn't whistle very well. This isn't the first thing that happened to me in the last few weeks, but it's definitely the weirdest. It could just be my imagination, but it sounded like someone was directly outside the bathroom door, whistling toward it. The other thing that happened was far less weird, and could have just been me not paying attention, but I came back from work to find that the lights in my roommate's room were on, and the fan was blowing out at the door. Even though no one had been home, and the other roommates' families lived quite a long ways from here. I asked where they were, and all of them sent back replies, showing that they were nowhere near the apartment. In 2011, my older cousin bought a small, 2-bedroom, single house in a quiet neighborhood for retired folks. The house was very small, with only 850 square feet of interior space, but it sat on a large plot of land. We could have easily fit 2 more houses like it on that lot, and still would have nice leftover space for yards and gardening. I was still a college student at that time, and I lived with my cousin. When he bought the house, I moved in with him. There were the 2 of us living there. According to the real estate agent, the house had been abandoned for around 3 years. The previous owner basically left it unmaintained and moved to a different state. The house had 1 main floor, a small attic, and an unfinished basement. The first time we walked in, the floorboards were already rotted out. We could see the basement through them. Everything was in horrible condition, and we would have to do major restoration to make it livable again. The property also had a small storage shed in the back of the lot. My cousin got a great offer, so he took the deal without much hesitation. Weird things started to happen when we began our restoration work. One day we were working on the bathroom. My cousin told me that he had to go to Home Depot for some stuff, and so he left. I heard him open the door, go outside, close it, turn on his car, and drive away. I was taking apart the old boards that were nailed on the bathroom walls. My back was facing the bathroom door. 5 minutes after my cousin left, the bathroom door, which was open, started to slowly move to the closed position. I knew this because I could hear the creaky old door sound that it made. I turned around and saw the door continue to close on its own. Then it stopped just as it touched the door frame and bounced back a little. I thought maybe it's just the wind. Then, suddenly the door pulled itself shut tightly, as if there was someone on the other side of the door. It happened right in front of me. I was only 4 feet away. No wind could have done that. Plus, all the windows were closed around the house, so there couldn't possibly be any form of breeze. You might think that maybe the AC caused it, but no. This old house did not have central AC. We had to put in window AC units afterward. At this point, I thought my cousin was messing with me, so I called out to him, but there was no response. Just silence. I opened the door, continued to call for him, telling him to stop playing around. But my cousin was not there. I checked the parking lot, and he was, in fact, gone. I even got outside and did a perimeter check, but no one was there, and I still cannot explain what happened. After the restoration was done, we moved in. My cousin sometimes went on business trips for weeks, and there would just be me in the house. The following happened whenever I was alone. One night I was studying and had my headphones on. I heard sounds of someone walking around in the basement, which was directly below my bedroom. It sounded like they had slippers on, and I could hear the sound of them dragging on the concrete floor with each step. What's weird was that I could not pinpoint exactly which direction in which it was coming from. It's a strange sensation when the sounds were coming from the back of my head, as if they were just right behind me. The only reason that made me think that it's the basement was because the basement was the only area in the house that had concrete and that could have made the concrete slipper dragging sound. So I took out my headphones, and the sounds of the footsteps still went on. The volume of the sounds stayed the same, with or without the headphones. I thought my cousin had come home early, so I called out to him and got no reply. I took the flashlight and went to the basement to check it out. It was dark and quiet. No one else was there. This happened 3 or 4 more times within the first 2 months that I lived in that house. After that, I didn't experience anything unusual anymore. My cousin never felt or saw anything weird, but he seemed interested in my stories. His girlfriend, now wife, who had been to the house every other week or so, also expressed her uneasy feelings during her stays. By 2016, during a thunderstorm, the thunder struck our storage shed in the backyard and burned everything inside it. Luckily, the house was untouched. I came home from work only to find a police officer waiting at the front. He told me what had happened and said that it was an act of God and that our insurance would compensate for the loss. In our Asian culture, people say that when thunder strikes somewhere, often it is to strike down a malevolent force or spirit. We quickly formed the realization that this thunder strike was more than just an accident. I got my own place and moved out a few months after the fire. My cousin bought another house with his wife a year after that. He still owns the creepy house, and it's been left unoccupied since 2017. He plans to tear down the old house and build a larger one to take advantage of the large plot of land. The experiences at this house were the closest I've got to what could be considered paranormal. I remember around 12 years ago, when I was around 11 or 12, I stayed over at my grandmother's a lot to keep her company after my grandfather passed away. I was lying in bed one night. I had just turned the TV off to go to sleep when I heard a creaking sound outside the door, but I just thought it was Grandma going to the bathroom since she had to walk past my room to get there. Then, I heard the handle being pulled down, and again I just thought it was my grandma, maybe just coming in to say goodnight before bed. As I looked toward the door, I saw a large, white hand grip the edge of the door, and instantly I knew it wasn't her. I was too terrified to say or do anything, so I just kept watching as the door slowly opened. Because of the window at the top of the stairs outside the room, there was just enough light from the streetlights outside coming through to see what it was. It was a tall, slightly transparent figure. It just stood in the doorway for what could have been seconds or minutes, or who really knows how long. I couldn't look away, and I refused to shut my eyes, even to blink, but of course, I had to eventually, and once I blinked, the figure was gone, with only the open door as proof that it wasn't my imagination. To this day, I still don't know what it was. I told my friends before, and they said it could have been my grandfather's ghost, but it was way too tall and skeletal looking to be my grandfather in my opinion, and I felt a deep, sinister feeling from it that couldn't be further from the warm, loving person that my grandfather had been. I've had a few odd experiences with things before that I could chalk up to imagination or overreacting, but as they say, you have to see it to believe it. And after that day, I certainly believe. Ever since, it's had me wondering what else could be out there. So about 15 years ago, I was living with my ex-girlfriend, my sister, and her husband in an old house not far from town. Within the first few weeks of living there, strange things were happening regularly. Lights going out randomly, noises upstairs. At one point, one of the windows at the back of the house was cut. Like someone had went in with glass cutters trying to break in, but gave up on it and left. Creepy stuff like that. That was bad enough, but things got pretty severe as time went on. One week in particular was truly insane. The first thing that happened that week was on a Tuesday night. Everyone was working, and I was home alone watching TV when I noticed that our cat was acting really weird, backed into a corner and arched up as though she was scared. When I went to get up, the electricity went out in the house, and it was pitch black inside. The second that happened, I heard really loud footsteps running down the stairs toward me. I got up and braced myself for whatever it was, but there was nothing. I gathered myself and went outside to the front garden to check if the other houses' lights were on, but my house was the only one that was dark. I went to the fuse box to reset the trip switch, and all was back to normal. A few days later, I think it was a Tuesday, we were all sitting in the living room watching a movie and eating a pizza. The lights were on, there was a good atmosphere in the house, when out of nowhere, a massive bang happened upstairs. We go up to check it out, and I went into our bedroom and saw that my bedside table was in the middle of the room. But the worst and last thing that happened to me was on a Saturday night. I'll never forget this. It still gives me chills when I think about it. We go to bed, everything's normal. We watch a bit of a movie and fall asleep. I wake up facing the wall and glance at the alarm clock. It reads 3:13 a.m. I turned over to go back to sleep and saw my ex standing in the center of the room. Confused, I begin to sit up and ask her what's wrong. But as I start to sit up, I realize my ex is asleep in bed next to me. A surge of fear runs through my core, and I'm frozen to the spot. My eyes adjust, and I just barely make out the figure. It was a young girl in a nightdress with a cartoon character on it, soaking wet, with her head looking down at the floor. I could hear the water droplets landing on the carpet, and I'm just sitting there totally in shock, unable to believe my eyes. After a couple of seconds, her apparition melted away and faded out of sight. I got up and turned on the lights and tried to tell myself that it was just a night terror or something, but the problem with that was that there was a wet patch where she had been standing. We moved out shortly after that. But I can still picture her to this day. Creepiest thing I've ever experienced. My partner and I had just become parents, and were looking for our first home. We found an older house built around 1910-1920, which seemed perfect. It was next to a good school and close enough to family that could help out with our daughter. Everything seemed great for the next couple of years, but there was always a heavy type of atmosphere that was hard to explain. And we had this feeling like we were being watched all the time. My wife was the first to notice it, and I would always brush it off as if there was nothing to be scared of. I always carried that mindset, as I was highly skeptical of any type of paranormal activity, and I always trusted the whole "if you can't see it, then it doesn't exist" paradigm. How wrong I was, it turned out. The initial signs were that things would go missing and then suddenly turn up in the most peculiar of places, like photos and my watch, which ended up in the bathtub. But most of the time, things seemed to find their way into the wardrobe that was in the master bedroom. Once my daughter woke us up in the night to tell me that someone had just walked out of her window. As she grew up, she would complain that the man was in her room and she couldn't sleep. I was still not believing that this could be a ghost, so I would comfort her and stay with her until she went back to sleep, and I watched a black-like shadow thing, which I can only describe as darker than the shadows around it, move from the corner of the room and out of the window. I went back downstairs and sat on the sofa, where the deepest growl I ever heard happened, which completely took me by surprise as it sounded as if it was right behind my ear. I nearly jumped out of my skin and thought I needed a drink. I went to the kitchen and I could hear laughter in the living room. I couldn't think of any logical reason for it, so I went back upstairs and sat in my daughter's room again for the rest of the night, but nothing more happened. Eventually, things escalated to the point where every night around 2 a.m., you would hear walking up and down the stairs so loud that we nicknamed whatever it was Mr. Boots. When my daughter was around 10, we would get massive bangs in the middle of the night. When it first happened, I honestly thought we were being burgled. I would run down the stairs only to find nothing, not a thing out of place. I had the plumbing checked and electrical, but all was good. Then, one night, I fell asleep downstairs, and an inflatable hammer flew at the TV, instantly waking me with the noise because it had a squeaker in it. I again was trying to work out how that had happened, and whilst I was thinking about it and looking at the hammer on the floor, it started spinning really slowly. I jumped up and walked to the kitchen, and again I heard the laughter. I then heard the boots on the stairs, and my wife suddenly comes down the stairs, woken by a really bad nightmare. While we were both talking in the kitchen, we heard the laughter again. Not long after this, we couldn't take it anymore and left. But I have hundreds of weird encounters, and I can honestly say that this house turned me into a believer. I always wondered what it was that was in that house. Ghost, demon. We still talk about that place now and then, and probably always will. Ever since we moved to our new house, I hear someone playing in my son's room when he's outside. Generally, I just wrote it off as something he placed precariously, that just fell or something, and then I saw it. Or her, rather. I was sitting on my couch talking with the wife about whatever we were going on about, and when I turned my head back to look at my wife, I saw a little blonde girl in a white dress peeking around the corner of our hall entrance that leads to my son's upstairs room. I immediately asked my wife if she saw it, but of course she was looking at me when it happened. It was basically right behind her. Just the other day I heard what I thought was my wife calling out, "Hey!" as she was doing laundry. I got up to see what she wanted, and she had no idea what I was talking about, and said that she didn't say anything. And she didn't hear anything either, even though the sound came from the area where she was, at the bottom of the stairs that lead to my son's room. Are there any Android apps or something that can help me communicate with the spirit that I believe is in this house? She seems playful, and sometimes I hear my son playing alone, talking to someone that isn't there, but when I ask him, he says he's just talking to his toys. From as early as I can remember, I used to fall asleep watching old, reel-to-reel black and white cartoons on my wall, like Steamboat Willie. I clearly remember the jittery, shutter-like quality of the cartoon from the old reel-to-reel projector. There was no actual movie projector in my room. At night, I would wake up to someone tapping me on the shoulder. I had a usual routine that I followed when it happened, which involved burying myself under my covers and telling myself that I would count to 7 and then turn over to see what was there. Not sure if there's a significance to 7. To this day, I like to end things with 7. For example, I set my alarm at 6:27 and not 6:30. But anyhow, I would go through the counting routine multiple times. I wanted to see what was there, but I was a kid and didn't really want to see what was there. My mom would tell me that I just needed to confront it and tell it to leave me alone. It took years to build up that courage. I don't remember exactly how long, but I must have been in my early teens before I actually did get the nerve up to turn over right away and tell it to leave me alone and stop tapping me on the shoulder. Once I confronted it, it did stop. Then comes my baby sister when I was 15. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night quite often. Once she was old enough to talk, she said that she was scared of the hand that came up between her wall and the bed and tapped her on the shoulder at night. "25 years ago, we moved homes. It wasn't in the greatest of areas, but it was better than we were previously. I shared a room with one of my 4 sisters. We had a TV in our room, but the remote control was broken, so we never used it. It stayed on Channel 5, the TV Guide channel. After a few months of living there, the TV in our room would randomly turn on every night and switch to Channel 33, which was usually Seventh Heaven or Full House that would be playing. No one in my family ever watched that channel. We didn't think anything paranormal about it. The house didn't feel creepy. Everything was fine aside from the TV turning on. Eventually the channel would change to a station with just static, and the volume would turn on all the way. It would scare us and wake us up every night, so we unplugged the TV. Ever since the station had changed to static, the vibe of the house felt different. It was heavy, and my sisters and I always felt afraid, but we didn't know why. After a year living there, we would experience weird things. Lights turning off and on, random noises, hearing kids. Our aunt lived downstairs, and she was always keeping her room locked, even when she was home. One day my sister and I went downstairs to grab the vacuum, and we heard jumping on my aunt's bed, and her door was wide open. My aunt was at work, so we poked our heads in to see who was there. We saw no one, but heard kids laughing and the bed moving, once again as if someone were jumping up and down on it. A few days later, we were playing in the living room upstairs, and we heard a cough coming from down the hall. We went to check on who it was, because no one was home aside from my sisters and I, and we were all together. We saw a man in black pointing to my sister's room, as if he wanted us to go. We were terrified, so of course we didn't. We stayed put until my parents came home. When they arrived, we told them what happened. They went to check out my sister's room, and there were scratches and crayon marks all over the wall and ceiling. We ended up moving out of the house when my aunt was sleeping with her door locked, and in the middle of her sleep, she heard the voices of 3 different men. When she tried to open her eyes, they were held shut. They choked her and laughed. She tried to scream for help, but she couldn't make a sound. She eventually passed out, and when she woke up, she felt as though she had been beaten. Her door was still locked, and everything was still in place. We thought it was sleep paralysis, as there were no signs of anything that happened. But later on that day, and within the next few days, there were bruises all over her body and around her neck. We couldn't explain what had occurred.